Hello, everyone. Good morning. On behalf of Current, I would like to welcome you to today's webinar on seeking a quicker, cheaper, and more secure green energy transition in the Nordics and how innovative grid technologies can contribute. As in other places, the energy transition in the Nordics brings both challenges and opportunities, with both increased levels of electrification, increasing renewable power supplies, but then also challenges such as congestion, price disparities, and operational challenges. In a moment, I will tell you a bit more about Current, but first a quick introduction to our moderator of today's session, Vivi Mathiessen, who is Vice President of Regulatory Affairs at Heimdall Power, one of Current's highly valued members, and will today be moderating this debate on our behalf. Welcome, Vivi.
Thank you, Leila, for that introduction, and welcome to everyone also from me to this Nordic event. And I'm very proud to introduce today's program with a very competent speaker panel. Who will present this issue from both a regulatory, market, and technical perspective. So the first speaker of today is Leila Sawyer, Secretary General of Current, who will present some issues related to how grid enhancing technologies can work, and indeed the potential. And then we will hear from Jan Kosteves from Acer about how infrastructure efficiency can be increased through regulation. Then we will hear from Caroline Törnqvist from the Swedish regulator, also representing Nordreg, the Nordic regulators today, about the Nordic study on local flexibility. Then we will hear from Asta Sivunen-Punka of the Finnish TSO about TSOs as enablers in the energy transition. Then we will hear from a large Finnish DSO, Caruna. Lasse Kontinen will speak to the grassroots of energy transition. And our last presentation today is by Robert Seguin from Tema Consulting, who will show us some results of effects of increasing transmission capacity, a study that they have performed. At the end, we have saved 30 minutes for panel discussion, and we invite all of you to send your questions through the Q&A channel for us to forward to the panelists at the end. And I should also make you aware that we are recording this webinar to be made available online afterwards, as will all the presentations be made available. So now, without further ado, I'm very happy to introduce Leila Sawyer, Secretary General of Current. Leila, please take it away.
Thank you very much. A few words from me about Current before the start of this webinar. So Current is the voice of Europe's innovative grid technology companies in Europe. So we are working on how we can make the most out of our existing grids, and also for long-term planning, use our grids as efficiently as possible. So what do we consider innovative grid technologies? So these are basically technologies that can increase the network's operational transfer capacity and maximize the efficiency of new grids. So this can be a number of technologies, new technologies or new developments in technologies, such as dynamic line rating, modular FACTS, superconductor cables, etc. And this is the technologies that we are representing in the Current membership. Another way to say this is that grid innovative technologies can control the timing of production and consumption, or they can divert the power flow to less crowded paths. So in case there is congestion in the grid, that you can divert it to a place where there isn't congestion. Or 3, to increase the capacity of the shortest path. So how can you with the lines that we already have, how can you transfer more? Or when we are building new lines, how can we transfer even more electricity through that, such as with superconductor cables? So why are these new innovative technologies so important? So we know that we are facing a huge challenge with reaching our decarbonization goals, and what we've seen with the Repower EU plan that was launched last month, that we are standing in front of a huge challenge with our grids to accommodate all the renewables that we now want to include. So these new technologies can actually help us face these challenges. For example, we have done a study at the end of last year, which shows that the grid enhancing technologies toolbox can together save 90% of redispatching costs in 2030. So in this study, we looked at Consentec looked at dynamic line rating, modular SSSCs and superconductors, and each one individually had an effect on both redispatching costs and avoided res curtailment. But together, they actually had an even combined much larger effect, together reducing about 90% of reduction in congestion and redispatch costs, and 3 terawatt hours of avoided renewables curtailment. And it could even be much more. This is also based on certain conservative assumptions, so this could even be greater in 2030. So why is it? So from that, it becomes pretty clear that innovative grid technologies are a very important part of solving the challenges that we have with increasing the share of renewables. But what is also important to realize is the timing. So we know time is of the essence for the climate crisis. The IPCC says we have about 3 years left, and a lot of grid enhancing technologies can be implemented in a matter of months rather than years. So this means that while we are figuring out our long-term plans, how to increase the capacity of the grids, building new grids, these things can help to actually do more right now. We've already discussed why it's cost efficient, so it can save redispatching costs, etc. And we've already seen that they are complementary with each other, so they are not all solving the same problem, but are solving different problems, so together greater than the sum of their parts. But we also see that they are complementary with grid expansion. So it's not either we do this or we expand the grids. We can actually, we are complementing each other by moving faster now. But the most important, I think, is that it helps us achieve our sustainability goals. We will be able to accommodate more renewables and to be able to reach net zero faster. So this is a bit of the work that we are doing in Current, and in this. But this is of course also something being carried out in the member states, in the different regions, which is why we are so happy to have this session on the Nordics today, where a lot of very interesting work is happening, a lot of renewable energy, a lot of investment in the power networks, and I'm very excited to hear from today's panelists. Thank you.
Thank you very much for that presentation, Leila. And indeed, in the face of the ambitious Paris Agreement, ambitious targets in the Paris Agreement, we need to act now to reduce emissions fast. And grid enhancing technology can indeed help that. So now I'm very pleased to introduce Mr. Jan Kostevis, Team Leader for Energy Infrastructure at Acer. So Jan has been with Acer for 7 years, but has in the past also worked for one of the European TSOs, where he was head of operational support service. Today, you will present Acer's position paper on how to achieve infrastructure efficiency through regulation. Jan, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vivi. Let's jump to the first slide. Yeah, thanks. Maybe just very briefly for those who do not know ACER, we are, as name says, a European Union agency for the cooperation of energy regulators. So the aim, of course, is to bring the regulators together and to help them cooperate, but also coordinate them to a certain extent in different European matters. One of such topics is also infrastructure efficiency, which was more or less triggered by us at ACER, seeing that there is actually not much happening with the TSOs in Europe or even DSOs in Europe in that regard. So first of all, why do we need energy efficiency? I think Leila already mentioned all of the benefits that are there. And really, there are so many that one is amazed that we do not see a huge dispatch of such new technologies across the world, basically. But what is the problem? So what is the underlying cause that we do not see this? What we have identified is that the root of the problem goes back basically to the DNA of how the TSOs are regulated, or DSOs, or any other regulated entity, and how these regulatory frameworks work. Because these haven't really changed much for the last 30 years or so, and they're all based on remunerating costs. So any investment that is being made by the regulated entity gets its cost repaid and a certain interest on top of it. Now, of course, to anybody who has some money on the bank, you know that the more you have on the bank, the more your absolute return is. And that means, of course, if you translate it back to the language of the regulated entities, system operators, and other regulated entities, that it means that, of course, you would always aim for a higher cost solution. And remuneration for these lower cost solutions, which usually such technologies are, is simply not competitive. The second thing, and I'm not even mentioning here, of course, the so-called CapEx bias, which is in itself a problem, but we believe that it's an even bigger problem, that the costs are simply not comparable, and the current regulatory frameworks really incentivize high-cost solution. The other issue is that transmission system operators in general, or anybody else for that matter, right, does not really like to see a lot of stress at their work and would like to avoid it to the extent possible. But bringing your infrastructure to a higher efficiency point means that you will encounter more operational stress. And that is a fact, of course, because you are using and utilizing your existing assets to a larger extent. So this means, of course, you increase the risks of the operation and you increase operational stress. And this is something that I also want to, of course, avoid. And here we have the two main reasons that we believe are the main culprits of why we do not see more and higher and better infrastructure efficiency. Can we move to the next slide? So we started work well before 2021, but and because we basically needed to understand the whole problem. Many times it was just, TSO saying that they need more money for such investments and so on. But the thing is that what the regulators observed was that 80% of all proposed innovative investments were being okayed, were being granted the remuneration of costs by the pertaining regulator. So it's not really that, it's not a problem of regulators not accepting such costs. The other two already mentioned problems are much more important than that. So we, back in 2021, started working on how to bridge this gap between the appeal of high cost versus low cost investments and what is most obvious of course, when assessing costs of any new infrastructure, of any new developments, any new investments, is that you also need to assess the benefits, right? And you compare the costs and the benefits. Since we already have the benefits and they would most likely very much outweigh the costs of such investments, we believe that the benefits are the most important part to look at in that regard. So sharing these benefits and not just repaying the costs is something that is as in a must do for a next regulatory framework if we want to incentivize efficiency. In that regard, of course, recognizing the whole value of investment and not just the costs of the investments. The other, a bit more systemic step forward is, of course, in the sense of the key performance indicators. We all know that those, of course, and there are quite many around measuring different things, but our current discussions with the NRAs show that what we want to see are indicators which really target efficiency and the outcome which is relevant for the end consumer. So not an indicator that says how many smart meters you have installed in the system, but an indicator which provides information on how well you're using these smart meters. So the key performance indicator topic is something we are already working on, and so is this principle of benefit sharing. And hopefully by the end of the year, we'll have something more on that. Thank you.
Thank you, Jan, for that very good presentation. Now I am pleased to introduce Caroline Törnqvist, Director at the Swedish Energy Market Inspectorate, and today representing Nordreg, the Nordic energy market regulators. So Caroline has been central in the Nordic regulatory work for electricity market design for many years, and today she will present Nordreg's recent report about barriers and possibilities for utilizing local flexibility in the Nordics. Please, Caroline, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vivi. I'm very pleased to be able to come to this seminar and very interesting to hear the other speakers as well. Well, as we have heard so far, this seminar is about the challenges that we will face in the near future due to the electricity transition. And from a regulator's point of view, those challenges are, of course, very interesting to follow and see what we can do to help the legal system to work efficient and meet those challenges in a good way. I mean, the Nordic region is not very different from other regions in Europe. I think we see the same challenges. It's challenges due to new renewable power coming into the system. We see a lot of re-electrification or a new wave of electrification all over the Nordic region. We see a lot of, the change in transportation with a lot of vehicles fleet that is electrified coming in and making or being new suppliers and consumers in this energy system. We also see in the Nordic system that we will have a lot more of import and export during the day or during the weeks than we have faced before. And all this will create a lot of new and very substantial challenges to the power flows in the system. Next slide, please. Thank you. So when we have had discussions with both the TSOs and DSOs, we have found that there are, of course, a lot of challenges, but here is some of them that we think we hear the most. It's about the difficulties for the DSOs and TSOs to know where will this new production come in and how to foresee that. We also see that the DSOs more now and even more in the future will have to communicate during the operational stages when the grid is operated, and how should this communication be, how should it work more or less. We also see that the DSOs and TSOs will need the customers to be more flexible in the future, and how can the DSOs and TSOs meet that challenge? And the last point here, which is also, I think, the key question that Asa mentioned here just a minute ago, is how to expand this grid in due time and in a cost-efficient way. Next slide, please. From the regulator's point of view, we think that the tool, or the most efficient tool and economically viable tool, will be to focus on demand side flexibility. And we also think that that implies that we need a lot of more market actors, as for example, aggregators and new energy service providers. And so it's nothing that the DSOs and TSOs can be all by themselves or fixed by themselves, of course. Next slide. Nordreg have, of course, limited resources, but we have decided to focus on some key components in our work, and that is that we think that it's very, very important that the rules we have and the rules that will come in this area are as clear as possible, so the market participants know what they can do in the future, and also that it will be transparent and possible for the DSOs and TSOs to understand how they can use flexibility. When it comes to the Nordic region, we think that it's very, very important that we have a level playing field for the market actors that will well, sell the products in the Nordic region. So it's very important for us to have a harmonized playing field, and that implies, of course, that the regulation needs to be harmonized. And the third point here, very detailed rules, on the other hand, will probably hamper innovation. So it's about the balance here. Examples of Nordreg activities that is ongoing right now is that we are following and coordinate the implementation of the framework or the rules for independent aggregators. We have together decided to cooperate when it comes to the development of new rules that is ongoing within Acer, among other things. And we have also decided that it's very important that we are following the progress that is ongoing in the Nordic region, and therefore we are currently mapping the development in the Nordic region when it comes to flexibility. Next slide, please. What we think is very useful from a regulator's point of view is that we have some quite clear rules stemming from the clean energy package in this area. That is something that we can build upon when we are examining the current rules, national rules in the Nordic region, but also if we should or could come up with the new or harmonized rules. Next slide, please. So when we have had this mapping exercise that I mentioned, we have discussed with both TSOs and DSOs, and what we have seen is that there are potential benefits, of course, with this also when you are, well, when we are from a DSO or TSO point of view. And what we hear the most is the following points that you see on this slide, that it could reduce delays when it comes to connecting new customers. It could avoid that tariffs need to go up, and it can also, of course, make the reinforcements that is needed to come in a little bit later. And in some cases, probably also reduce expansions of the grid. On a more TSO level, I think it's the same points more or less, but you could also maybe mention that it could help the TSOs to operate the grid more efficient and to a lower cost. But this, I guess we will hear from Fingrid in a couple of minutes. Okay, next slide, please. One part of our mapping exercise was to look into the local flexibility markets that we see are growing in some parts of the Nordic region. There are pilot projects ongoing in Sweden. There is 4 in different parts, and we have one larger in Stockholm area. And we have a similar project in the south of Norway. And we think that those local flexibility markets could be key, or could at least enhance the possibility for the DSOs to use flexibility as a tool in the daily business. And it's a shift from private or bilateral contracts to a more open and transparent market platform, which we think is very, very good. New slide, please. Okay, when we have mapped these local flexibility markets and talked to DSOs using those markets, we can see that there are a lot of challenges, of course, because this is new area and many DSOs find it difficult to, I mean, you're used to building grids, but this is a new area of work. How do you procure flexibility, and what will be the rules for that, and so forth. So that's something that we as regulators, I think that we could focus on in the upcoming work program for next year, for instance. And we see also that those local platforms have different rules, and for us it's interesting, of course, to reflect upon what would be the ideal setting for local platforms. We have also discussed within the Nordic region, is small local markets good, or would it be better to have like national local platforms instead? That kind of questions are of interest for us regulators. Okay, we also have understood very clearly from the discussions with the DSOs that and key for DSOs to get into this unknown territory of buying flexibility is that there will be incentives for procurement of flexibility in the national regulations when it comes to the income regulation. And we also have had discussions when it comes to the competition between the tariffs and buying flexibility, since there might be the same actors involved in that. Okay, there is a lot of more interesting reflections that I could share with you, but I think I stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Caroline, for that very interesting presentation. And I think indeed we will come back to some of that during the panel discussion later. And also in a while we will hear from a DSO about how they use flexibility maybe as part of their toolbox. But now I'm pleased to introduce our next speaker, Mrs. Asta Sivonen-Punka, Executive Vice President for Markets in Fingrid, the Finnish TSO. So Asta is central in the cooperation between the Nordic TSOs, for example, in the work with the Solutions Report to meet challenges and opportunities of the Nordic transmission system. Today, Asta is presenting from a Finnish perspective, but some of the challenges are indeed Nordic. So how can the TSOs be facilitators in the green transition? Please, Asta, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Vivi. And I'm very pleased to be here attending this event and telling about the Finnish experience, but also quoting a bit what we as the Nordic TSOs have together prepared, so to be able then to respond to this energy transition challenge. So may I have the Next slide, please. So we all in the electricity and energy sector are faced with this challenge of energy transition. And we as TSOs have the role of enabling that transition and that change. So I would say that the national specificities may differ, but the main thing is that there is this huge increase in renewables and how to cope with that. So when it comes to the infrastructure, when it comes to the market design, but also the system operation. So when looking the Finnish challenge, so you can see the map, so that describes the areas where we have the most inquiries of onshore wind. So onshore wind is the major source of renewables in Finland. And what we have seen quite recently is that there is really a drastic increase. So when it comes to inquiries and also the total amount. So currently we have something like a bit more than 3,000 megawatts that is in place. But what we see now is that summing the current capacity and also the connection agreements that we have made, so that will amount up to 9,000 megawatt already in 2025. Can I have the next one, please? And here you can then see the challenge when it comes to providing the infrastructure needed. So the maturity of the generation is up in the north, whereas the consumption is in the south. And this means that we need to strengthen the north-south transmission quite heavily. When we move to the next slide, please. So we have been looking at the various scenarios, so how the generation, but also how the consumption will develop. Currently in Fingrid, so we are in the process of preparing various scenarios, and on the basis of then building and providing towards the end of this year the so-called electricity system vision. Previously, we have been preparing network visions, but now we have concluded that it's also important to take into account the market design, what kind of changes we need regarding that, and also so whether we need and what kind of changes we need when it comes to system operation. So on the left-hand side of this picture, so you can see the current 4 scenarios that we have prepared. So power to products, meaning that we will have a massive increase in renewable generation, mainly onshore wind, and we are using that to produce various power to X products and then exporting those. Hydrogen from wind then differs from this first scenario in the way that from this massive increase in renewables is then used to produce hydrogen, then that can be used to replace the other energy sources, for example, in industry, and in that way then to reduce the CO2 emissions. Wind disease relies more on the offshore wind that is really in the minor role at the moment. So there are just some windmills that have been built on the seas, but in the scenario we are working on that alternative. And the local power then requires the least new transmission capacity, as there both the generation and consumption is located closer to each other. But these are the scenarios that we will be working and then looking at the needed infrastructure developments in the grid. The next one, please. the next slide. Yes. And what I also wanted to tell here, so there are major changes happening in the Finnish power system with the help of these changes that I have described, mainly related to the major increase in renewables. So we are in the way or on the way to become balanced when it comes to power. So, and that will happen very soon, so 23, 24. Of course, there are major changes when it comes to, so when we need to either import or export, but on an annual basis, so we will be balanced. We will get more nuclear power, thermal will decrease. We will also have an increase or a significant increase in solar, and the role of interconnectors will be really important, so for balancing the system. May I have the next one, please? So as we have heard in the previous presentations, so it's not just building new infrastructure, but also using these various new technologies that will also help with the transmission challenge. So in Fingrid, we have planned that about half of this needed north-south transmission capacity will be achieved by using compensators. So we see that that is really a cost-efficient, fast way, and also saving the environment, as we do not need to build that much new transmission lines. We have been using these technologies since 1997, so they are not that new to us, but we see that there is a need to further increase their use. What is new is that we are building 20 kV parallel condensators to support voltage in our 400 kV grid. And this will then further increase the transmission capacity. And then finally, we are in the process of deploying dynamic line rating, because that will then help us to make better use of the thermal capacity of the power lines. May I have the last slide, please? I just wanted to bring to your attention the Nordic TSO strategy that we have quite recently prepared in our Nordic TSO cooperation. There we have especially looked at the wind development and sector integration, and what is the role of TSOs, and especially the role of Nordic cooperation to respond to these challenges. It has clear themes where we need to cooperate, including adequate infrastructure, but also the secure power system and integrated market, and we need to look at the energy system as a whole. The strategy is complemented with a detailed implementation plan that we are now following and working, because we see that to deliver all these changes that are needed, so we need to cooperate strongly together. So thank you, and I will be back for questions, so when we have the panel discussion. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Asta. And cooperating strongly together, that is indeed a good cue. And I think we will pick up some of this also in the discussion later. Now I am pleased to introduce our next speaker, Mr. Lasse Kontinen, Head of Strategy and Innovation at Caruna, one of the major Finnish DSOs. So Lasse has previously worked for the Finnish TSO and for ENTSO-E in Brussels, where he was responsible for compliance monitoring. Today, he's presenting Caruna's works to facilitate the green transition from a grassroots perspective. Lasse, the floor is yours.
Yeah, thank you for having me. And the grassroots means that now we have had quite a lot of high-level stuff. So my idea is to go close to customer and to have the local view, which probably applies to all Nordic TSOs, at least on some level. And the strategy and innovation team has the crystal ball at the Caruna. And I would like to show a few glances which we have had about the future on the next 4 fully packed slides. So if you can go to the next one. Yeah, so on the right side, you can see that there's a map of Finland. And when you see orange and yellow color, that's the 2 companies in Caruna Group. So we have the rural company, Caruna Oy, and then the city company, Caruna Espoo. And they are quite diverse in a sense that 1/3 of our customers are located at Espoo and 2/3 on the yellow areas. As you can probably see, so then the people on the yellow area have quite a lot of grid. So it's approximately 160 meters per customer on Caruna Oy, and then on Caruna Espoo it's only 35 meters. So there's 5 times more grid on the Caruna Oy side, and there's quite a big difference on the pricing in a sense that the customers at Espoo have probably the cheapest distribution prices in Finland, and then on the Caruna Oy side they have quite a high prices. So we have like both sides of the equation, that we have the rural issues and also the city issues, which are quite diverse actually. So when you are thinking about the green transition or energy transition, so it's not the same if you have a city company or if you have a rural company. So that's an important thing to know. And on the left side of the slide, you can see the basic picture that what are the main drivers or maybe the impacts of the green energy transition, that the generation will be weather dependent and distributed in the future. And also the markets, at least I hope this, that will be more distributed, not like one huge market, even though it would be nice to have one huge liquid market, but the DSO needs are highly local. So we need lots of local markets, so one market won't cut. And then also the transmission, it's important, but the importance also of the distribution grid gets higher because there's lots of TSO-like tasks for the DSOs in the future. So for example, the electricity don't go anymore like to the customer. It can come from the low voltage customer upwards to some parts of the grid. And the customers, as you can see on the right side, it's the important part of the equation. So they are more active. So they have a lot of more components, not anymore like a passive consumer. So, and one of these things, well, I will discuss about Espoo in detail on the last slide, that what kind of challenges we have in the city grid, but please go to the next slide. Yeah, so here you can see that we have 3 different scenarios. So we have base regarding the energy transition. So that's according to the Finnish energy transition targets. So then we have a violet with more optimistic forecasts, and then early saturation. So when we have an extremely high energy transition speed, so it means that some of the key parameters are already saturated. And it shows that if we go with this base scenario, it looks quite conservative, and it is probably so, that there's only like 12% increase in the peak grid capacity. So this is the thing how we need to dimension our grid, that when we have the highest power, so we have to build the grid to respond that we won't have any kind of a curtailment or any other issues on our grid. So 12%, but on the highest scenarios at the end of year 2040, so we have a 50% increase. So it means that we have to like build 50% more grid, and that's not sustainable. So we need more tools on our toolbox if that occurs. And of course, the speed of the change is different depending if you are in the city or in the rural areas. So you need quite a lot of different kinds of tools. And if you look on the right side, so the 4 main drivers, I would say, which are driving the change on the left-hand side. So wind power is big. That's mostly on our high voltage grid. And then solar power, that's mainly on the low voltage and medium voltage issue. So these are, of course, production challenges. And then electrical vehicles and heat pumps. So, or anyway, I would say heat pumps and electrification of district heating, and also a general electrification of the domestic heating. So those are the big things that are actually driving our grid dimensioning. on the low voltage and medium voltage level, and of course they aggregate on the high voltage level. And yes, as you can see, there is a high increase of production, which has been like almost non-existent. So that's the up and down in a sense for the distribution, or should I say transmission in future. So are we like a mini TSO in the future? That could be. So we need quite a lot of new tools for that. Plus then that we have a huge electrical peak load coming from the vehicles and also from the heat pumps, if they are not smart. So that's a big question, of course, that how they are handled. And actually there's then this next slide, which is discussing about that issue. Yeah, so 2 pictures. And this is more like now the grassroots stuff. So on the previous slide, you saw averages on the whole Caruna group area. But we need to, of course, design our grid on the low voltage circuit level. And then we have a huge amount of grid there. And just to do the old way, just pure distribution expansion is like having a hammer, and then all the problems are nails. So we need also a saw and a thongs and some other tools for our toolbox. And first thing, before selecting the tools, we need to know what is the problem. So on the left-hand side, you can see that there is some kind of a metering information, and the network capacity is overloaded. I mean this black line, and we need to go on the red line with some kind of a solution. And we have a couple of ways to do it. So there's a curtailment, we just cut off the customer. So that's out of the toolbox, we won't use it. So then there's extreme tariff incentives. That's also pretty old school, just to punish the customer wanting to use the electricity. Then more modern ways to do it, flexible connection, that we have agreed with the customer that we can cut off their electricity, or they will cut off on certain periods. Then grid expansion, that was the old hammer, and it's still a good tool, but not for every reason. And then demand response, which was already discussed on the previous presenters, so that we incentivize the customer to change their demand. And also virtual grid capacity additions like battery energy solutions, or a dynamic line rating on the higher voltage level. So those are like the tools which we should use on the toolbox. So maybe the first one is the thing we shouldn't use except on the dire need. And then when we just saw, okay, that was one customer or one grid part. So we have quite a lot of grid around Finland. And if we have just one base estimate with one grid topology, it won't work. So we need to run huge amount of power flow simulations. And we are lacking actually the tools to do it. I mean, we have tools, but they're not flexible enough to do everything that we need in the future. And that's the first thing, when we have identified the problem, to then have the local solutions. How should we do it, the whole thing with high social welfare? And for example, we first need to know, is it a low voltage, medium voltage, high voltage problem? Does it have a high energy or high power, or both? So if you have a high energy problem, so then the distribution expansion is a good solution. But if it's a low energy, high power problem, so then we need flexibility. And just to go to the last slide, so there is our idea about flexibility, that how it should be dealt with. So if you can go to the last slide. Yeah, so here is our view on the local flexibility framework. So main thing is that there's a chicken and egg problem. Is there a demand first or production first? Or let's say demand response, and then some buyer. So demand in this side is the DSO. So we have already some challenges on our grid, that, for example, slow permitting and construction cost in the cities. So if we want to have some high power connection really quickly, so we need some kind of solution just to get by before we can do probably the distribution expansion or something else. For example, this rapid district heating in Espoo. So if we suddenly lose our power plants there, it's not ours, but a production in our grid, and it turns into high consumption point. So we need something really fast, and we cannot build it fast enough. So that's the first thing for this kind of a demand response issue. And then there was lots of discussion about the markets. So of course we could have independent aggregator, electricity retailers selling us demand, or our own flexibility platform. But if there's no market or only one seller, it doesn't make any sense. So it probably will start with bilateral agreements, and then it will go on the right side in a sense that we will have more liquid markets. And one thing which I want to highlight also, that there's the DSO resources, which are more like an interim solution, but it's important in a sense that we select the option that is most beneficial for the customers. So for example, BLR. So we are not incentivized to use it, but of course we will use it anyway, but we will lose with that when we are actually maximizing our resources, how we use it. So it's important for the future in a sense from the regulatory perspective that also the CAPEX innovations are incentivized on our regulation. And also in a sense that if we buy some flexibility, so it's not sanctioned on our regulation, so that there is a healthy balance and the regulation is predictable and transparent in the future. But I think I overused my time already, so I will end it here and have it for the discussion afterwards, the rest of the stuff, if there's any questions.
Thank you, Lasse, for an interesting presentation from the grassroots. You say you need more tools in your toolbox. The hammer doesn't work for everything. Well, indeed, I hope this webinar can give you some suggestions, and I'm sure we'll get back to that in the panel discussion. Now, I'm very pleased to introduce our last speaker of today, Mr. Robert Seguin, Senior Consultant at Tema Consulting Group. Robert has previously worked for a large Norwegian DSO, where he was responsible for R&D. So, Robert, you have analyzed welfare effects of increased transmission capacity in the Nordic electricity market. And that will be interesting to hear about. Please, Robert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Vivi. I'm very pleased to be able to talk here on this webinar, and good morning to everybody. Now you can also see me. Fine. Now we have everything in place. I work for Tema Consulting, as Vivi said. We are a consultancy company that's based in Oslo and specialized in energy and energy markets. And if you go to the first slide, then these energy markets indeed have been all over the place in the media in recent times. We've had unprecedented high electricity prices, especially in Norway, which is a country that has been used to very low power prices over the last decades, so to say. And the question is, what stands behind that? And there's a lot of things that come together right now in the situation in the Nordics and in Europe. We have seen soaring gas prices, partly driven by the political crisis, the war in Ukraine. We've seen unusually dry weather that led to empty hydro storages all over the Nordics. We have grid issues, we have higher CO2 prices, and all that together is forms something that we call the perfect storm. All these factors that usually moderate themselves point into one negative direction or positive direction, if you want to see it that way, leading to higher electricity prices. And indeed, a lot of things have been, or a lot of fingers have been pointed at the grid and bottlenecks in the grid. And here's one excerpt that I like particularly well in the middle, where it says Sweden's electricity grid is Norway's bottleneck, which is an interesting punctuation, interesting way of seeing it. And also international interconnectors have gotten part of the reasons why the electricity prices are so high right now. So if you go to the next slide, here's here are average prices from the spot market in the Nordics for one day, and it's not a record-breaking day at all, but I just took that because it makes two things very apparent. One thing is the high power prices that I already mentioned, where you see 180 euros per megawatt hour in southern Norway, 130 in southern Sweden, and over 200 in Denmark. And again, especially Norway has been a market where we have hardly seen average yearly prices over 50, 60 euros per megawatt hour, and especially 2020 was very extreme in the opposite direction with very low power prices. The other thing that you can see here is that you have a decoupling of the different markets, of the different price zone in the Nordics. For those of you who don't know, Norway is split into 5 different price zones. Sweden has 4 different price zones, Denmark 2, and Finland has only 1. But in Norway and Sweden, we see that the power prices in the north have completely decoupled from power prices in the south here. And that, again, one particular day, you see that the power prices are not lower than 10 euros per megawatt hour in the north, and the high prices that I mentioned in the south. So what we did in our little study that I want to present to you today is we took our in-house power market model that we usually use to create one of our core products that we offer to our clients, and that is a power market outlook where we simulate years up till 2050 and the resulting power markets in different scenarios. And this power market model gives us the opportunity to vary one or more parameters at a time, if we wish for that, to see what the impact is on the power markets. If you go to the next slide, then you can see I took out 4 different scenarios here where we varied the transmission grid capacity for all Nordic interconnectors between 10 and 20%, and an additional scenario where we took out the interconnectors that we thought were most critical. So we took only 4, which are essentially the north-south connections in Norway and Sweden, and some cross-border connections from northern Sweden to northern Norway and southern Sweden to southern Norway, just to show you how much it matters to actually know which grids we need to reinforce or equip with advanced technology. Now, it's important to remember that this is 1 year in 2025, the way we look at it. There's no investment optimization in these runs that I'm going to show you. So usually the model can invest depending on what it deems is most profitable. Here, we just hold the complete production capacity constant. So it's important that when we talk about generation and prices, that we have a constant production capacity in the whole model region. So we then looked at the effect the increase in transmission capacity has on 3 different KPI areas. Looked naturally at the electricity prices, but we also looked at the generation mix in the Nordics and the total socioeconomic welfare that I'm going to come back to and say a few more words about what that is in our model. So on the next slide, you can see the impact on the electricity prices, and there's 3 things that you can see. First of all, you see that the northern prices, or the prices in the northern zones rather, increase quite a bit because they now couple more to the south, which in turn couple more to the continent. You see significant price convergence, which is a result of that, and that has a very positive effect on the liquidity in the markets, because right now, even though the northern areas might look large, they actually represent very small markets, and limited liquidity in these markets becomes to be a problem for the efficiency of the market. So this is something that you would mitigate by price convergence. And last but not least, you see that when you go from the 120% scenario, which is the third one, all the way to the right to the select scenario, which also increases the capacity by 20%, but only on those 4 selected lines, you see almost no difference. So you don't have to instrument the whole grid with new technology, or you don't have to reinforce the whole grid, but you have to reinforce the parts that actually represent the actual bottlenecks. On the next slide, you see the effect on the power production in the Nordics, and I'd like to ask you to pay special attention to the last 2 bars on the left-hand figure, which are the overall results of the Nordics, and you see that you get almost 3 terawatt hours over the 1 year additional production, mainly wind and bioproduction in the Nordics, just by adding grid capacity internally in the Nordics. This is somewhat lower in this case for the select scenario, but you still get 1.5 terawatt hours more production into the system just by increasing grid capacity. You also get some reduction in thermal capacity, but there's actually not so much left in the Nordics of thermal capacity. There is, of course, some in Denmark, for example. This can be mitigated, but the major effect is that these 3 terawatt hours additional renewable energy in the Nordics can be used to reduce imports from the continent during times of peak load, and this is then usually gas-powered electricity. So if you look at the reduction of CO2 emissions you get from this additional renewable energy, you see that the major part actually happens on the continent, not in the Nordics, although it is something that you do in the Nordic countries. And you see that the sum amounts to 1.5 megatons of CO2 that you can avoid in electricity production by this reinforcement step of 20% increase in the Nordics. So last but not least, the last KPI we wanted to look at on the next slide is the socioeconomic welfare, which consists of consumer and producer surplus and congestion rent, which is essentially income you make on interconnectors between different zones. So if these price differences decrease, this income also decreases. But the takeaway here is that you get a total welfare increase of 450 million euros in the Nordics and an additional 75 million euros on the continent, again, just by increasing the transmission capacity. And the reason for that is, of course, that you have less locked in wind in the northern areas that you otherwise would have to curtail in 2025, and with the increased transmission capacity are free to use in other areas. So as conclusion, if we look at these 3 things again on the next slide, you can say that there are several positive impacts of increased transmission capacity when you keep everything else constant in the system. You have stronger incentives to build out renewable energies in the northern parts that usually have very good wind conditions because the prices increase there. You have more efficient markets, and you also gain significant electricity amounts just by adding grid capacity, not by adding production capacity. And the social total welfare also increases. Now it's important to, if I may, 2 things that are important to look at here. The first thing, this is one specific year in 2025, and all these numbers are to be taken with a little bit care, I would say, because this is a year where the strong grid bottlenecks between the north and the south that we heard Fingrid speak about, and that are also present in Norway and in Sweden, are still there. Right, and there's a lot of grid plans on the way that plan to alleviate these bottlenecks. But this shows exactly the problem that we have, because building transmission lines takes time, right? And in this study, it doesn't really matter where this extra transmission capacity comes from. If it comes from new lines, or if it comes from say compensators or DLR or other enhancement technologies. But what is sure that the implementation of these technologies would save us a lot of time, which we have learned in the introduction is of the essence. So thank you very much. That was all I had. Back to you, Vivi.
Thank you very much, Robert. Those are some interesting findings, and certainly I would think food for thought. Now I would like to invite the speakers to join me for a panel discussion by turning on your cameras. And for the audience, please keep posting your questions in the Q&A channel. Robert Mork, my colleague, will help me gather questions that we will then forward to the panelists. So it has been said that the grid is the backbone of the green transition, and we all want the same thing, to enable an affordable and timely transition to a carbon-free future. And the geopolitical situation at the moment is pushing this even more. So clearly, more grid is necessary, and it is not our intention to propose create a false dichotomy between investing in the grid on the one hand and using new technology on the other. We must do both, and in a balanced way. So Jan, I heard you say that regulation of DSOs and TSOs in fact is a barrier towards lower cost incentives when it increases, even when it increases efficiency. But changing the regulation is not so straightforward. And we have a question from the audience about this, saying that most TSOs are still government owned, where they would plow profits back into the system or circulate back to the government. So how are you going to motivate these to prioritize investments away from very safe current policy to new technology, when they will argue that they are focusing on performance? So Jan, do you have a comment on this?
Yes, well, I think this is a bit, maybe there is a bit of a misunderstanding here, because of course regulated entities in most of the cases are sort of state-owned, but the thing is that they are regulated, and that's the problem. The regulatory framework basically sets the stage in which they operate. So it's not about the returns going back and the TSOs claiming that, well, the returns go back to the people. Basically, the returns would actually be much greater if they would use these grid enhancing technologies, because the difference between the costs and the benefits is much bigger than that. So there is absolutely no reason for that. But the thing is, the problem is that all of these entities here, both regulators and also, of course, TSOs and DSOs here, they have a huge inertia, right? So it's very difficult to change the direction in which they're going. You need a lot of time, and you need a constant push from different sides to make them change. And we see that some regulators are slowly changing in this direction. For example, in Italy, they already implemented with great success one of such benefit sharing schemes. It's not specifically targeting innovation, but there is no reason why innovation could not take part in it. But all in all, it has proven very, very successful. So I think this benefit sharing principle would definitely be to the benefit of all. It would be a win-win situation, both for the regulated entity, system operator, whoever, and of course for the consumer, who at the end is always paying for all of this.
Very good, thank you, Jan. And then inertia in the system. You're talking both in regulators and in grid companies. It would be nice to hear from a grid company in this respect. Lasse, in your view, does the regulation give sufficient incentives to utilize new technology? Would you have any comment on what Jan just said?
Yeah, first I would like to comment on Jan's issue on the profit sharing. So I have to highlight that, for example, in Finland, on the DSO level, we have a highly advanced profit sharing system. So for example, for the CAPEX efficiency, so we return our efficiency increase to our customers approximately every 4 years when we have the new regulatory asset prices. So if we have been efficient, so then the customers can enjoy lower distribution tariffs. So we have such a process already in place. So that's a thing that it's really good for our regulatory system. But then if we go to the new technologies, and especially buying demand response as a service, so that's a problematic thing because it's a new on a DSO level. And what would be necessary is to put the OPEX cost for buying demand response on the same level as the grid expansion, that they are equal from the DSO point of view. And also, if we have like a new solution, DLR, or maybe a battery energy system, or something similar, which is more CAPEX based, so that's not included our innovation scheme. So those are like the important updates that needs to be put in our regulation, in a sense that everything is on the level playing field. So those are the things that pop on my mind immediately when I'm thinking about it. And of course, the main thing for the regulation, because we are doing investments for 50 years, is that it's predictable and transparent. And with transparent, I mean that it's understandable. So we could have a highly advanced, really nice mathematical equation which solves everything, and no one understands what it really does. So then it doesn't incentivize anything because we don't know what's happening and we are just risk averse afterwards. So yeah, predictable and transparent. So that's the main thing for the regulation, and probably some flexibility there for the previous issues which I mentioned, but that's quite a problem to solve. Yeah.
Okay, thank you very much, Lasse. Yeah, predictability and transparency in the regulation. That sounds like good thing. Now there is a question to your presentation, Caroline, about setting up a flexibility market. And wouldn't that require better visibility of the low voltage and some medium voltage grid? Without the visibility of the grids, it's difficult to know where the flexibility indeed is. So what are the requirements existing and upcoming to ensure that DSOs are capable of grid monitoring and analytics to ensure safe and reliable operations while incorporating new flexibility markets?
Yes, I just would like to echo first what Lasse said about the transparency. And I think that the regulators are very well aware of all those difficult issues. And it's also, of course, very challenging to design an income regulation that steer in the right direction. The question here was more about, I think, the kind of information that the DSOs need. I think I don't have the answer to that question in detail, but I mean, I think that there is a lot of real-time information that is needed to be able to use flexibility. So it's a change from perhaps the kind of data that the DSOs are using for, I mean, the grids or developing the grids to some kind of more real-time data when it comes to consumption and the real-time production. I think the DSOs will be the ones that will tell us what kind of data they need. And we also, and that is something that Jan maybe could tell us a little bit more about, the rules are upcoming on the EU level on the local flexibility markets and the kind of information that is needed to access those markets and to use the markets. We will see.
Okay, very good. Now I see two hands raised. Leila, you were first, and then Lasse.
Yeah, just to touch on this point of transparency and that the DSOs need transparency, but I think also from the perspective of technology providers and service providers, also a certain amount of transparency is needed on what are the problems, so we can also come with good offerings and how these decisions are actually made, you know, whether to invest in more grids or what solutions to use. So I think that the transparency is a very, very important issue, but also a two-way street also needed.
Lasse and then Asta has a comment.
Yeah, if I can start on the metering side, as it was mentioned that there should be some visibility on the medium and low voltage side at what's happening and what kind of issues there are real time. And I think there's no DSO in the world currently which has real time measurements for low voltage and medium voltage side. But in Finland, at least, we have the second rollout of our smart meters starting mid of this decade. And probably there we will have a capability to show that what are the issues in real time with our real-time measurements. But currently we have the data like day afterwards. So that was just a comment on that, that probably no one has it on the low and medium voltage side as real time.
True, but it is the prerequisite to use local flexibility, isn't it? So it needs to come into place, I suppose. But Asta, you had your hand up as well.
Yes, I just wanted to bring into this discussion that economic regulation is mainly decided on a national level. So there is quite a lot of subsidiarity. And when looking from Fingrid viewpoint, so we haven't seen any, I would say, difficulties in using also these other measures than just building the grid. So the main thing is that we have the current and the potential customers who want to be connected and who need then that their electricity, either it's generated or consumed, so that needs to be transported. So this is really a big challenge. We have just updated our investment program for the next 10 years. It amounts to 3 billion euros. And within that program, so we are building infra, new transmission lines. We are also, as I presented, so looking and using these new technologies, because half of the needed new capacity will be done with the help of that. And then additionally, so we are also piloting and looking at this flexibility resources and flexibility markets, because we see that there are these certain areas in the grid, so where we need to use those resources to manage the transmission bottlenecks, for example, to keep Finland as one bidding zone and to enable the connection of these resources.
Very good, thank you, Asta. Yes, indeed, the economic regulation is national. And Jan, you raised your hand during this. Did you have a comment to this? I
Actually,
guess that, yeah.
I already had my hand up before, but I was aiming to maybe target a bit my reply to Lasse, because he mentioned that there is already sort of an appropriate incentive in the sense of sort of profit sharing, but I mean, everybody needs to be very careful in approaching these things, because if the incentive is that after a regulatory framework, your tariff goes down if you're successful, it's actually also a counter incentive. You could also aim to try to keep it up, because you know that if you're too successful in one period, regulatory period, in the next one you will have lower tariffs, meaning also lower income for the business. So it's not easy. I think actually the incentive should be a big reward for a certain period, which would really strongly stimulate the system operator to invest into innovation. And then when this innovation is proven, it should become the new standard. Let me just give you one example of the one that Leila already mentioned, I think at the beginning, was dynamic line rating. There are hundreds, and I think I'm not exaggerating, pilot projects across Europe. Every TSO has its own pilot project on dynamic line rating for 10 years and even more. And the technology is proven beyond reason, basically. Everything is showing that the concept works perfectly. On the other hand, TSOs still opt to use the classical system, which is basically limiting transfer capacity to basically allow the line to be operational at the most critical, also almost the most critical foreseen circumstances, 35 degrees Celsius, 0 wind. You know, it's basically things which happen maybe on a couple of days per year. And when they do happen, you are likely to be above the actual limit, physical limit of the line. So these static limits of the line make no sense. So not only for increasing the grid's capacity, but also for keeping the system secure, such technology should already be implemented everywhere. And very last point, efficiency. I think I fully agree that we will not be able to fix everything with efficiency. We need to build more grids and we need to do it fast. But I think what is very important is we owe it, I think, to the consumers that we are first efficient with what we have, and then we go to build new things. We cannot just say, okay, efficiency is a nice thing, but let's build because we need to build. No, let's first be efficient, show that we use what we have to the best extent, and then we continue by building. Thanks.
Thank you, Jan. It's good, I think, that you are impatient on behalf of us all to get the efficiency first and to ensure we reach our targets. as soon as possible. I see you have your hand up, Lasse, but I'm just going to quickly give the word over to Robert also, presenting the results of increasing transmission capacity in the Nordics by 20%. It led to a significant welfare increase, etc. But Robert, increasing 20% on critical cuts by using grid enhancing technology, is that even realistic?
Oh yeah, I think so. I think it's very realistic. I mean, it will also depend on specific cases. It will depend on the technology used. It will depend, if we talk about dynamic line rating, it will depend on the specific grid spans that are the most critical ones. But if we look into the literature, then values between 15 and 25% on average are absolutely achievable. Of course, it's supposed to be dynamic, right? In our study, it was a static increase, so it doesn't really reflect the dynamics. So this could be added to the value, especially thinking of that the increased grid capacity during high wind times where the lines are cooled correspond to times where we have high production from wind. So this is a nice win-win situation between the two. But absolutely, 20% I don't think is unreasonable at all.
And to come back to Leila's comment at the beginning, that this is something that can come into place within a very short period, whereas building transmission lines, indeed, we know can take at least 5 years or more. Now, Lasse, did you have a brief comment?
Yeah, brief comment on the Jan's issue on our capex efficiency, let's say, incentive, in a sense that if we would do something like that we would do inefficient investments and others would do efficient ones, so then we would lose. So only way to get it done is to collaborate and have an illegal cartel. So then all the DSOs would be criminals. And we have even approved that we are quite responsible, because start of this year, so we had the unit price update, and there was cut of a few billion euros from the regulatory asset base of the whole industry. So we have competed quite fiercely, and now it's returned to the customer with the update. So at least in Finland, it seems to work, this kind of incentive scheme. So that was just an update. I want to say that at least the Finnish DSOs are responsible on this sense.
Okay, I see we are the time is running, very many good questions, but Robert, you've been keeping an eye on the chat here. Could you put forward a couple of comments or questions? Or then I see you have your hand up, Asta. While Robert gets the questions together, I'd like to hear from you. Yeah.
Yes, I had just a short question to Robert. So I was a bit surprised to see this big increase in bioproduction or biogeneration from Finland. So what is that based on? So that was something I was a bit surprised.
Yeah, essentially that's a result of the price development, right? I mean, it's also always the reference to the reference case. So if you get higher prices in areas, then you get producer surplus, because you don't change anything in the production capacity, right? You just get paid more for the same production. And vice versa, in countries where you have lowering prices, then you get a negative producer surplus, so to say, because you get paid less.
Very good. Robert, Mork, are you ready to bring some questions from the audience, or shall I take?
Sure, I'll throw in. I think you've been doing great, but one of the questions that occurred to me was whether we should think of these technologies in terms of being sources of flexibility in and of themselves. We tend to, when we talk about flexibility, we often talk about load and generation and using them in new ways. But what about these technologies? Should they be part of the flexibility discussion, or should we think about them more in terms of transmission?
Yeah. Anyone want to comment on this? On this comment? I guess it's fair to say, at least, that these technologies in a way are prerequisite in order to utilize flexibility from both especially the demand side, or the local demand side. You need that visibility in the grid, right? So some form of grid monitoring is indeed necessary, I would think. So we've seen the results from the TEMA report, and Leila started out by showing some results also from a Consentec report, which was presented last year, with the significant benefits from deploying grid enhancing technologies. So in a way, also with Jan's impatience on our behalf, it has all been said in a way, but why is it not happening? So how can we move faster? Asta, do you have a comment on that?
I can mention that in this Nordic TSO strategy that I just briefly presented with one slide, and where we had one pillar with adequate infrastructure. So one of the measures there is that we look at the new technologies and make use of the, I would say, the most capacity of the existing grid, because as has been stated, so it takes time to build new infrastructure. And then against that background, so we need to use the existing one in the most efficient way. And that is something that we will be looking together with the Nordic TSOs. And these measures that we have listed are for the short term. So from this year until something like 24, because we see that we need to work on these. So we are responding to that as well together.
Very good. And on that note, for more cooperation, I will hand over to you, Leila, for some closing remarks.
Yeah, so thanks everyone for the really great discussion today. It's great to see how much is happening in the Nordics, and you know, the progress that we are making there, and also to sense everybody's sense of urgency, that we are also feeling. So without further ado, I'd like to thank all of you for your participation today. I don't think we got to all of the questions in the chat. We can try and get to them after the webinar, or you can always reach out to us at Current, and we can also direct them to the right places, so you can find. And we will be sharing the slides and the recording with the participants. Yeah, so of course, do not hesitate to be in touch if there are any further questions on our side, from your side. So thanks to the panel, everyone, and have a good, it's not a Monday, it feels like a Monday. Have a good Tuesday.
Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Bye.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.